Hi, everyone, and welcome to our virtual NWSA office. My name is Christian Contreras. My gender pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm reporting to you live for the unceded territory here in El Paso, Texas, of the Tigua Pueblos people. And I am very happy and grateful for your presence here today for our joint program in partnership with the AAUP Center for Defense of Academic Freedom. I will not yap at you because I'm known to keep on going and I want to make space for fruitful dialogue with our speakers as well as to make time for questions from our audience. But I want to emphasize this space is a learning space, a collaborative one. We'll be sharing resources throughout the duration of this session in the chat. I urge you to share your questions, your thoughts, your feedback, and any other helpful tools in the chat as we move forward, as we'll have time to engage with you. But until we get to that point in the program, I want to offer my deep gratitude for Liz Monagary, who is an NWSA member and associated with the Center for Academic Freedom, who beautifully reached out to us to trigger a thoughtful conversation about what a program of this sort would look like as we navigate these tumultuous times. And so you'll learn more about Liz. Her full bio is longer than a dissertation, but throughout today's conversation, we'll make sure to highlight everyone's contributions and affiliations. But Liz, feel free to join me on our figurative stage and take it away as our moderator with our fellow panelists.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. And thanks, Christian, for that fabulous introduction. And it's been really wonderful getting to know you as we prepared for this event. And thanks to Courtney. And of course, thanks to Kate Taylor from the Center for Defense of Academic Freedom. These three offered some brilliant logistical support that have made tonight possible. So huge thanks to them. And thanks to all of you for coming out. I will turn things over to our fabulous panelists in a moment. But I did want to say a few things about how this event came to be and what we're kind of hoping to do here tonight. The Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom is a collaboration of scholars, teachers, and activists who are committed to preserving and expanding the conditions that make it possible for students and academic workers to work, to teach, to learn, to create, and to share knowledge. Moreover, we understand academic freedom, along with other key principles like institutional autonomy and shared governance, as being the conditions of possibility for critical thought and for insurgent knowledge production in the academy. This is especially true for identity-based interdisciplinary fields that have emerged out of activist intellectual traditions. Now, to be clear, academic freedom alone is not sufficient to achieve the broader political goals at the center of gender and ethnic studies like decolonization and abolition. But the absence of academic freedom, we argue, would foreclose the very possibility of these outcomes. And I'll just pause here to shout out a fellow at the center, Vinita Singh, who I think has been really helpful in articulating this kind of vision for academic freedom. So our first panelist tonight, Isaac Kamola, who I'll introduce momentarily, is the founder and director of the center. So I know he will tell us more about the center's work. For now, I just want to say that in addition to generating research and creating practical resources, the center is really committed and inspired to an ethics of collaboration. We know that we're going to be better equipped to resist the intensifying attacks on everything, if we're organizing in solidarity with the people who have been at the forefront of fighting to preserve the transformative potential of higher ed for a long time. So to this end, we've been reaching out to professional academic associations like NWSA, and tonight's event is a step toward lifting up and contributing to the amazing work that NWSA and its members are doing and have been doing on these fronts. Our hope is that we're going to open a larger conversation about what academic freedom is and what it might mean for the future of women's gender and sexuality studies. Our speakers this evening are going to tackle a few specific questions. What is academic freedom? What are its greatest threats right now? And what specific tactics and strategies are being deployed? But along the way, we're also trying to spark a larger conversation about what a capacious understanding of academic freedom can offer our campus organizing efforts. In what ways can academic freedom provide a frame for building solidarities across struggles around research and curriculum, student struggles for the freedom to learn and the freedom to protest, and broader struggles for worker autonomy and workplace democracy? In our frantic attempts to respond to the onslaught of increasingly repressive and violent actions, we don't have to retreat into a defensive posture, and we don't have to abandon our critiques of the university. This is a pivotal moment for our field, for higher ed. It's a moment when we should be putting forth our distinctly feminist, queer, and trans visions for what we want from colleges and universities. Thinking seriously about why we value academic freedom and what it makes possible is an invitation to think more deeply and more imaginatively about what it means to study and work in the academy and how and with whom we organize our campuses and our communities. So with those framing comments, I will turn things over to our first panelist. And I think I'll just introduce you, Isaac, and then I'll introduce the next speaker after you're done. So Isaac Kamola is an associate professor of political science at Trinity College. He is the author of Manufacturing Backlash, a brilliant report detailing the legislative attacks on academic freedom during the 2021, 22, and 23 legislative cycles. The author of Free Speech and Coke Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War, and Making the World Global, U.S. Universities and the Production of the Global Imaginary, along with dozens of journal articles and book chapters. He's currently the director of the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom and founder of Faculty First Responders, a program that monitors right-wing attacks on academics and provides resources to help faculty members and administrators respond to manufactured outrage. So without further ado, I offer you Isaac.
Hey, Liz, thanks so much. That was such a generous, introduction, and also a really helpful overview of what we hope to do at the center, and to think about this partnership with the NWSA and other professional associations, and these conversations about academic freedom, and a real clear articulation of what we are as academics and scholars, and what we really hope and demand from our institutions. So what I want to do is to just talk about academic freedom and what it is and its core principles. I think that in this day and age, there's so much kind of crisis that we're constantly responding to these crises and attacks on higher education. We lose sight of what academic freedom is when it's working right? When academic freedom is actually working, what is it? And that's a really important thing to understand, to have a sense of what we are fighting for, and also what the limits of what we are fighting for is, and what might be a horizon beyond that. So I just want to, first of all, express a really sincere gratitude to Kristen, Courtney, and Kate for doing all of the legwork that made this happen, and the fellow panelists today. What I want to do is talk about kind of what academic freedom and why, and the way that it's created in the American context, talking about and then talk about the AAUP's particular definition of academic freedom, how this definition of academic freedom is or is not institutionalized, and then also why what Liz calls the identity-based fields, as well as sites of insurgent knowledge production in fields like women's and gender and sexuality studies, queer studies, critical ethnic studies, why they're so important, and why academic freedom plays an important role in those particular sites, and how to think about academic freedom as an ethical practice. So first of all, I think it's really important to think of academic freedom in the U.S. context as being distinct. In many countries around the world, higher education is part of a federal education system, and so there's federal law that clearly spells out what rights a professor does and doesn't have. Because you have this certain number of years of probation, and then you receive a certain status, and here's your job classifications, and here's your rights and responsibilities clearly laid out in federal law. Because the United States is some combination of private institutions, public institutions across 50 states plus territories and indigenous nations, that you have a whole bunch of different kinds of institutions that are all governed in a highly heterodox way. This led to a lack of academic freedom protections. And this was really important at the beginning of the 20th century, when you had, in the context of the First World War, professors who were being fired because they're communists, because they're socialists, because they're pacifists. And there are a lot of high-profile firings, basically treating professors as at-will employees who could be dismissed at the whim and will of the Board of Trustees or the presidents. This led to the formation of the American Association of University Professors, which laid out in its founding document, the 1915 Declaration, a kind of a moral principles of academic freedom. I like to think of the 1915 Declaration as kind of the Declaration of Independence of academic freedom. It's the kind of statement of principles that makes the argument as to why academic freedom is important. The statement of principles then becomes kind of refined in the 1940s statement of principles on academic freedom and tenure. This is more of the constitutional document. It's co-written by the organization that's now the AACNU, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, which is kind of represents administrators, trustees, and institutions. So you can think of that as management. You can think of the AAUP as representing faculty, and it's a statement that's co-written by those organizations that's really around this question of how to institutionalize academic freedom. That statement lays out academic freedom in three places: in the freedom to research, which basically says the right to kind of follow an argument and a set of ideas wherever they lead and to publish those results. The freedom to teach, basically based on the argument that I know it's best to teach in an African politics class or a political economy class, that my board of trustees should not be determining what I should be teaching, and that a fundamental aspect of academic freedom is the freedom to teach, and that the public good is served when teachers and professors are free to teach what they have expertise in, as well as the freedom of extra and intramural speech, which is basically the right to speak as a citizen, right? To be able to say what we want in public and to participate in civic life without fear of losing our position, kind of premised on the argument that in order to be a professor, you have to have a position at the university. However, if you write an op-ed or participate in a demonstration or say something in public that your boss doesn't like, you shouldn't be then lose your ability to do the profession that you've been trained for. So this was institutionalized in this 1940 statement in the institution of tenure, which basically, again, was this compromise between management and the faculty that basically says that the position of professor is a special kind of job that you should have a probationary period. If you're continually assessed and renewed over a period of 7 years, then you receive tenure, and that means that you can only be non-renewed for cause, which means that instead of being an at-will employee, the college or university has to demonstrate that you have acted in ways that demonstrate that you're no longer fit for your position, right? That you've demonstrated that you are no longer fit to do your research or teaching. And so basically and in order to demonstrate cause, it has to be done through a faculty-led procedure that's clearly spelled out and includes due process. So it's kind of this agreement, right, that says if you engage in the production of knowledge, you're evaluated and peer assessed, you get this position that then has these extra protections. So that's kind of like the system of tenure that was negotiated, like I said, between the AAUP and the AACNU, and has now been signed by more than 250 professional associations. So again, this is not something that's necessarily written down in federal law, but is kind of a norm that is adapted in different ways. And one of the ways that it has been adapted is that it's been incorporated in faculty manual language and campus policies. It's been incorporated into collective bargaining agreements. It also has the normative enforcement. The AAUP censures schools and institutions that do not abide by academic freedom. So, for example, if you fire a professor for speaking out on Palestine, there's a process by which there is a report that is a detailed a report and a possible vote of censure that says that institution is in clear violation of academic freedom. And increasingly, there's this recognition that that tenure itself is not a sufficient enough protection, especially in the day and age where 75% of faculty now teach not on the tenure or in tenure track positions. And there's a recognition that in addition to tenured positions, we also need to understand the governance and shared governance process as part of the protection of academic freedom. So I think that is really helpful to think of academic freedom in the American context as being this kind of very, very deeply contested space that in 1915 and 1940 and those pivotal statements is really based on this notion of expertise that through being trained as academics by going through this rigorous training process of graduate school and being credentialed in particular ways, we are assumed to have certain kinds of expertise. But this gets me to kind of this deep tension that's at the basis of academic freedom and this concept of academic freedom as laid out by the AAUP that I think is really a generative one and a really important one for us to grapple in this space. And this is the point that I'll leap off on. But Joan Scott has brilliantly argued that we should think of academic freedom as an ethical practice. And in their essay by that particular name, Joan Scott lays out this kind of tendency for there to be these kinds of different kinds of communities within the higher education space, which she calls a disciplinary community, those that are deeply committed to the discipline. I'm a political scientist, and I'm oftentimes told that what you're doing is not political science, right? Those gatekeepers that say this is what the discipline is, this is not the discipline, you're doing something that's not the discipline. And then there's also the critical community, which is like those of us who are pushing against the discipline to move it in different directions. And basically what Joan Scott says is that this is exactly where the importance of academic freedom lies, right? Is that constant good faith tug of war between established regimes and disciplinary communities, standards of what counts as a good argument and good evidence, and then the critical communities that are pushing those boundaries in new and interesting directions. You wouldn't have knowledge and knowledge production if it remains this kind of canonical disciplinary gatekeep body, and you wouldn't have that kind of that hard boring of history that's against that's placed in tensions of existing regimes of knowledge. So I think that in spaces like women's studies, gender studies, queer studies, critical race studies, indigenous studies, a number of those places where insurgent knowledges are created, I think it's really important to be to think about the role of academic freedom and the ways in which these spaces have been so important in pushing disciplinary boundaries and disciplinary communities, and that the ways in which an approach and an understanding of academic freedom has to really understand both that special role that scholars have, but also the role we have as critics of our own institution and trying to balance and to engage in that practice in ways that are ethically, politically, and ultimately, hopefully, also a liberatory. So, thank you.
Thanks, Isaac. Okay, we'll take a breath. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Karma Chavez. Karma is professor and chair of the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Karma is most recently the author of The Borders of AIDS, Race, Quarantine, and Resistance. She is on the executive committee of the AAUP chapter of UT Austin and co-founder of her campus's Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine. So without further ado, I offer you Karma.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate it. And Christian and Courtney, good to be back in community with you. Thank you for this. Kate, thank you as well. Really important conversation. and excited to be in conversation with Isaac and Rana and all of you. So unlike Isaac, I don't study this stuff as an academic. I've been thrust into this by virtue of this great state of Texas and my own politics around higher ed. And so, yes, I was a long time on the governing council of NWSA, for better or worse. So I'm going to spend my time. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happened in the state of Texas since 2023, because I think it is very instructive for other states who haven't experienced what we have experienced legislatively. And I also think that if you haven't been following, you'll probably see resonances if you're from a blue state, for example, with what your administrators are doing without being asked or forced by your legislature. And so it's a way of suggesting we're all in this together. This isn't a red state, blue state kind of issue. Like this is hitting us all. So I'm gonna go back real briefly to 2022. So in February 2022, when there was a lot of talk about so-called CRT, this was before people were really talking in the same way about DEI. The University of Texas Faculty Council put out a statement that affirmed our faculty's right to academic freedom in teaching, and in particular that our faculty had the right to teach CRT. That really pissed off our Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, who immediately put out a series of tweets chastising loony Marxist professors and said that he was going to take away tenure and ban CRT as a way to get back at us for this sort of flagrant, issuance of our rights as faculty. So Texas legislature only meets every other year. So in 2023 was when the ledge would meet. We were pretty convinced that he was going to make good on his promise. And so we got pretty organized, both as sort of faculty who weren't necessarily involved in AAUP, as well as those who were. But we worked closely with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and then AAUP, ATF, AFT. And so we were targeted specifically by 3 bills in 2023, 17, 18, 16, 17, and 18 were the bills, Senate bills. 16 targeted teaching about race and gender in certain classes. 17 targeted DEI, and 18 targeted tenure. In its original form, 18 would have banned tenure outright. In its original form, 17 would have banned DEI outright, and the same can be said with 16 and CRT. So we were very organized. We fought very hard. The end result of what happened in 2023 was that the CRT bill, it never made it to the House Committee on Education for a hearing. So that was off the table. 17 and 18, though, did make it through the entire process. Both were signed into law, though they were in lesser forms than they originally were. So we do have tenure in the state of Texas at public universities, but we essentially adopted Texas A&M's tenure policy, which in my view is one of the worst and weakest tenure policies in the country. And so now the whole state of Texas for public universities has that. We can be terminated for a whole host of reasons, including engaging in personal behavior that reflects poorly on the university. And there is no due process for any faculty member who happens to be terminated under SB 18 until after they've already been terminated. Tell me how that's due process. I don't know, but that's how it's written. There's also the possibility for summary dismissal without any faculty input at all. And AAUP, the Texas Conference, has had to work with about 70 faculty who have faced this or other disciplinary action. So it's been pretty severe. And then SB 17, banning of DEI offices, DEI in hiring, and DEI organizations has had sweeping, very negative impacts across all of our campuses. On my own campus at Austin, exactly 1 year ago today, about 60 former DEI staff, 80% of who were women of color, mostly Black, were given pink slips because their jobs were deemed redundant, even though they were no longer in DEI positions. And so it's had very far-reaching effects. So that was 2023. We knew it was going to be pretty bad, but we were waiting for what the 25 session, which we're in the midst of now, was going to bring to us. In some ways, I think it's interesting how things have changed in terms of the targeting. And this really maps onto something that Isaac was saying earlier about faculty governance. So if most of the faculty aren't tenured anyway, faculty governance is kind of our pathway to academic freedom. But following his best friend, Christopher Rufo, Dan Patrick proposed a bill as a priority bill, which means it's going to get a hearing, SB 37. That's the bill, the primary bill we're fighting right now, although there are several. And SB 37 targets faculty senates and councils. So he hasn't lessened his hatred for faculty councils. This bill is particularly damaging because it would ensure, first of all, that there would be no faculty governance involved in the appointment of anywhere from the dean to the provost to the president, the chancellor. All of that would be politically appointed by the Board of Regents. So that's the first thing it does. Second thing it does is it makes faculty senates composed 50% appointed and 50% elected, but only the tenured faculty can be elected to the Senate or to the council. And so, as you can imagine, that cuts out a big portion of the population, not to mention many of our community colleges in Texas, which don't even have tenures. So I think it would mean that faculty councils couldn't exist at all. The other thing, two other big things, there's many things, but the two other that I'll mention here that SB 37 does is one, it has a provision that says it would ban any teaching that endorses a particular legislation, policy, or ideology. That's verbatim the way the language is written. So when I gave testimony a few weeks ago, I said, you guys put into place one of these far right schools for civic leadership a few years ago. And if you look at their about page, it's all about these different ideologies, Western civilization, the American constitutional tradition, etc. I was like, so you can't have it both ways. If you're going to ban ideology, like we will come after you for these other ideologies, right? So, but of course it's meant to target people like me. The other thing it does is it would essentially put all Texas public universities and colleges into receivership because there's a provision in the law that says that the Board of Regents, which is politically appointed in the state of Texas by the governor, which is always Republican, in recent memory, that the Board of Regents can overturn, quote, any decision made by campus administration. So essentially that is receivership because faculty and even administrators would not actually have a say in what happens on campus. So one of the things we find very interesting about this bill is that it's given up on the culture war language. And so it's just focusing on faculty senates. It would put in a new Office of Excellence in the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to manage all this. It seems all very benign. And I think that's one of the things that makes it very dangerous because it's designed to do the things they couldn't do in 2023, but in different language. There is another bill that I want to mention briefly before I cede my time, which is SB 2714 in the state of Texas. Now, this is proposed by a far-right senator. His name is Mays Middleton. He's actually a UT Austin graduate, apparently hated his time there. But because everything is really after UT Austin, like everyone else is sort of collateral damage, unfortunately. What SB 2714 would do now, it's using culture war language. So it has an entire laundry list of the kinds of things that it doesn't want to see taught. But it's not banning any courses. It's not banning any departments. It's not banning any professors. Instead, the tactic here is that any course that in its course description, its course objectives, course overview, or in any graded written or oral assignment cannot have anything that relates in the present to intersectionality, gender or racial bias, marginalization, you name it, any of the kinds of things that we teach in gender studies or the ethnic studies folks teach. None of that can be taught for any course that's part of a general education requirement. All those courses can still be taught on campus, right? Not a violation of academic freedom, but they can only be taught by departments like mine for my major. Now, anybody who knows anything about how universities work, that will completely gut my department, Black Studies and Gender Studies, because people take our courses. I only have 45 majors. So everybody else who's taken my courses, they're taking it because my course fulfills a general education requirement. And that's how it works. So by removing us completely from general education, it essentially will lead to the dissolving of our departments, because the other provision in this bill is that no state appropriations can be used for any instructional expenditures for courses that cover these topics as they relate to the present. Now, you might say, hey, look, you're in the state of Texas. At UT Austin, only 11% of your budget comes from the state legislature anyway. Like, have UT figure out. You got the largest endowment in the country. Like, what's the problem? The problem is the lesson that we learned from SB 17 in 2023 is that state appropriations was defined so widely, right? That even private funding, say if there's a scholarship meant for a particular identity group, that was deemed by our legal office, at least the UT, and I think that's pretty consistent across the UTs, as state appropriations. And so we can't just use endowment funds to support departments like mine. And so, again, it's a different tactic than they used in 2023, but it's the same ends. And while I think, unfortunately, they're going to get by without violating the First Amendment, because the way that these laws are written, or these bills are written, if they become law, they're going to have the same result. And I fear, this kind of thing is coming for all of us. Last thing I'll say is, there haven't been lawsuits filed against these bills or these laws in Texas, in part because we're in the Fifth Circuit and we know there's going to be a bad outcome. And so we kind of have our hands tied, which is going to mean that, relating across the different regions is going to be really important. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Karma. That was very helpful. All right. Our final speaker this evening is Rana Jalil. Rana is an associate professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies and Asian American studies at the University of California, Davis. At UC Davis, Dr. Jalil is a 2022-2025 Chancellor's Fellow and a 2021-2024 College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Faculty Fellow. Her first book, The Work of Rape, received a 2021 Duke University Press Scholars of Color First Book Award and was co-winner of the 2022 Gloria E. Anzaldúa Prize from the National Women's Studies Association. Dr. Jalil is a co-editor of the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal. She has served at the national level of the American Association of University Professors for over 15 years, and she presently chairs the association's Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure. Without further ado, Rana.
So first, thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be there. Before I begin, I just wanted to share in the chat, and I think I've accidentally been sending them to not everyone, but just some people. Did I send the first one? Some of the broader work that's been going on at the AAUP. So now they're going to be out of order. Oh, wait, I got it. So there are two lawsuits that you should be aware of. The first is about cuts to the funding at Columbia, and the second one is about deportations. There are also injunctions that have been filed in both of those to stop the Trump administration from administering further cuts or trying to deport more people. There's also a memo that went out today that I think I just posted. Did I just post it or not? Yes. About that's urging general counsels of universities under Title VI investigations to not comply and supply identifying information. It's actually unlawful for them to do that. And finally, and this is going to get more to the substance of my remarks, I think it was yesterday, but I'm losing track of the days. I don't know about y'all. There's a new Committee A statement, and that's the committee I chair. It's been a committee since 1915. It's the Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure for the entire AAUP organization. And we just released a statement on academic freedom and attacks on disciplinary knowledge. And it argues that governmental intervention, like attacks on the autonomy of academic work concerning the histories of slavery and race, public health, gender and sexuality, and biomedical and other sciences, aims to substitute partisan politics for academic judgment. So it gets absolutely to the heart of how these ongoing attacks that have happened for years now, they're not new under the Trump administration to our fields, are so central for understanding the current moment that we're in. So I was asked to talk about Title VI and Title IX together. This is almost impossible in 10 minutes. So I'm going to give you some kind of framing remarks. I'm happy to go over some of the legal issues if you want to talk about that as well. But I'm someone who's trained in law, but no longer works actively in it. But I do want to talk about the legal limits of Title VI and Title IX and their inability to fulfill even the promise of the Civil Rights Act, so which is not, of course, the promise of full liberation in this moment. And to also think about Title VI and Title IX at a moment and how they're being used at this moment when commentators and scholars are increasingly recognizing our time as an anti-constitutional moment, or at the very least, a constitutional crisis. And so in this kind of context, I can't stop thinking, and I mean this very broadly beyond how the law has been interpreted, what does it mean to block access to education? Because access to education were what these Civil Rights Acts were about, and they came out of the demands of other social movements and Third World Liberation Front, like all this stuff that created ethnic studies, gender studies, and was part of a transnational movement for liberation, that understood education as being super important. And so what's happening now, and how do those older struggles fit into this moment? So to sketch out some of this, I'm going to just make kind of do three kind of things. The first is to set the stage and explain where we're at by contextualizing the rise of Title VI and Title IX right now within this moment of authoritarian challenges. So just to refresh, Title VI prohibits discrimination on the ground of race, color, or national origin under any program receiving federal assistance. And the way the regulatory mechanism works is that if a federal agent charged with enforcing the statutes, like a university, or in this case, actually, excuse me, if the federal agent charged with enforcing the statute, that'd be the Office for Civil Rights, for example, finds that an institution that receives federal funds, such as the University of College is not in compliance with Title VI's non-discrimination mandate, then they can suspend or terminate federal financial assistance to the program or provision within which that institution is in violation. So they can withhold funding basically, but there's supposed to be a process to this. Title IX has a similar regulatory mechanism, but it prohibits sex-based discrimination in education programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. So the first thing I'm going to do is think about those two things together in this authoritarian moment. And then I'm going to say a little bit about the history of Title VI, its original aims and its rationale, and the history of Title IX as well, in order to, and this is the third point, to think more deeply about the history of race, gender, and racialization since World War II as less a story of legal progress that's now threatened by an autocrat, and more a story of political gamesmanship. And it's a way to think about the irony of how right-wing culture warriors who campaign against so-called gender ideology, the teaching of slavery, critical race theory, and DEI, are now harnessing the power of the Civil Rights Act to address anti-Semitism on campus, and in the process evacuating any promise that the purpose of the Civil Rights Act. So first, with this, I want to talk a little bit about anti-constitutionalism to say how we got here. And so for a legal scholar, Aziz Rana, and that's not me, Aziz Rana is no relation. Constitutionalism is failing in part to the breakdown of the post-World War II Global Pact, where the United States stood for the promise of, and here's a lot of stuff that some we might like and some we might not like, but the United States stood for allegedly equal liberty for all. The Constitution was the framework for the realization of that promise. And it meant that we understood the Constitution as committed to alleviating racial inequality. We thought about principles of anti-discrimination, had an anti-totalitarian account of civil liberty and speech rights. But this was also baked into a defense of market capitalism that was partially hedged by a constitutionally entrenched regulatory social welfare state. But we did embrace institutional checks and balances with the federal courts and the Supreme Court in particular as the ultimate arbitrator of the law. And this was all part of a commitment to U.S. global primacy that was organized through robust presidential power, so the robust presidential power isn't necessarily new. But part of what held all this together was that there was a specter of the Soviet Union. This is Aziz Rana's argument. So that political elites were willing to pursue cross-party compromise on behalf of racial reforms, understood by center-left and center-right alike as national security imperatives. So it's not perfect, but there's something happening that was happening then we're absolutely not there now. And some of this has to do with what Aziz Rana describes as a rise of minority rule that can target democratic progress of the last century. And we know that's Trump, that's MAGA, that's Elon Musk. But the reason that they can do this is because so much of our progress wasn't embedded in the Constitution or through constitutional reform. It was achieved instead through legislative, judicial, and executive cooperation and reinterpretation of the Constitution that didn't actually change it. So that makes it easier to go away. And we can think about that example with Dobbs, for example, and the attacks on substantive due process, or the selective attacks on substantive due process. We're not going to see them go after homeschooling, for example. But what I'd like to add too is what I'd like to add to all this is that a greater emphasis on the legacies of 1968, which include the Civil Rights Framework, but also the institutionalization of gender studies, Black studies, critical ethnic studies, and post-colonial studies, which destabilized the idea of uninterested or apolitical knowledge, and use this to kind of think about what's been a long counter-revolution against them. That's part of the story of Title VI and Title IX, and it's the context for the issue of anti-Semitism on campus. So again, to go back to that question, what does it mean to block access to education on campus? And this is I'm on the second part, just a brief history of Title IX and Title VI. So Title IX, at the moment that it's happening, it has a sizable impact on women's access to education and educational programming, because this is a moment when we have a congressman, and it seems less shocking now in 1970, declaring in Congress that, quote, certain biological conditions, maybe lunar, maybe puberty, during pregnancy and menopause, might render women unfit to navigate public life. And so this Congressman Edgar Herman continues and says, suppose we had a president in the White House, a menopausal woman president, who had to make the decision had to make a decision on the Bay of Pigs. So anything can happen, knowing women psychologically during this period or during their lunar problem, anything can happen from them going up and eating the paint off chairs. That's the quote, so it's a little grammatically incorrect. But this kind of public sentiment was something that kept women out of educational spaces and opportunities. So the passage of Title IX did open the door and educational access for many, but not necessarily all women. And to give just one example, in 1972, 15.4% of men and 9% of women in the United States had completed a four-year degree. But as of 2021, 39% of adult women over age 25 have a bachelor degree versus 37% of adult men age 25 and older. So this is the kind of access issue that Title IX was meant to address. It wasn't about policing the boundaries of gender necessarily. And so here's one more example, and it's a pretty little known fact. Under Title IX, integrated athletic systems were understood to be the ultimate goal, not segregated ones. So as the National Organization for Women wrote in a 1974 memo, quote, now as opposed to any regulation which precludes eventual integration. Regulations that protect girls and women are against now's goal and are contrary to our stand with the Equal Rights Amendment. But nonetheless, in 1975, the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Health and Education and Welfare issued guidelines for implementing Title IX and ending sex discrimination that allowed sex segregation in athletics. And I bring this up because it's a suppression of a history that's helped naturalize a scientifically contested idea of gendered and racialized sex difference that in turn shaped subsequent policies that govern women's participation in college athletics. So while all of our scholarship in trans studies, critical ethnic studies, feminist science studies has understood sex as fluid, has challenged the understanding of sex as fixed and gender as fluid, as a recent historical invention, the issue of women in sports has, as Katie Barnes observes, helped stabilize the notion of sex segregation as a form of social equity. So, there's when we're thinking about access and the original goals of these movements or these acts and the movements behind them, however flawed they are, they looked a lot different than what we're seeing now. And the same is true with Title VI. Which was kind of unfolding during a time of complete lack of access for Black people in higher education in particular. So this is how the National AAUP Council understood the situation in 1962. They said, quote, the basic issue at many institutions of higher education, especially in the South, goes deeper than a matter of institutional governance. It concerns the willingness of our society and the educational community finally to accord fundamental justice to, quote, Negro citizens, end quote. And it goes on to think about to call on administrators and academic institutions to welcome Black Americans and just Black people in general into their institutions as students, to consider them for faculty positions without restriction or discrimination, to let them in. And so I bring up all of this not to denounce the impulse to legally include other groups within prohibitions against discrimination based on race, color, national origin, or gender, because there have been kind of like expansions of what national origin means under Title VI law to include ethnicities in particular. And I don't bring it up to deny that impulse, but to think again about Trump's executive order as DEI dies, as Texas considers SB 2714, which Karma talked about, in a very powerful way. And to again ask the question, given these histories of Title IX and Title VI, what does it mean to block access to education? So now I'm at the end, I'm at part 3. And what I'm getting at broadly here is the need to think more deeply about the history of race, gender, and racialization, and insist on our stories and history now, and not back down on it. And so that's one of the reasons the AAUP, I chair committee A, so I propose that we write a statement about the subjugation of academic knowledge, and particular academic knowledge, because they're not really coming out, they're coming broadly after universities, but they're still coming very specifically after what we do. And that's built on, as I think we all know, a longer history of attack and degradation. So if we're thinking about Title VI and Title IX, this is the context that lets us consider the irony of how right-wing culture wars try to address anti-Semitism now. So this is the convergence of far-right culture wars, and not just national, but geopolitical situations. And that's where we can start thinking about what it means to address anti-Semitism as at the same instance as we're gutting everything else. So here we might think about Kenneth Marcus and the Brandeis Center. Kenneth Marcus has been really instrumental in the focus on anti-Semitism on campus since at least Bush the Younger's presidency. I always get the Bushes confused, so excuse me for that. But we might also consider the idea of anti-Semitism that Marcus peddled, and that's one where, quote, anti-Israeli animus, end quote, exemplified by pro-Palestinian protest is the evidence of anti-Semitism. So that line has been going on for a while. The Brandeis Center, for example, has filed complaints based on the discomfort of a student who heard suitemates, quote, accusing Israel of committing genocide against the Palestinians, end quote. So there's a lot to say here about the conflation of anti-Semitism with a political viewpoint like Zionism, but there are also a couple of other issues that I want to really briefly touch on, and that really say something, I think, about the importance of our disciplines and our scholarship. There's something really tricky that involves the risk of stereotyping a religious group when one turns to shared ancestry or national origin as the index of discrimination, when that religious group contains other ethnicities with other distinct histories of persecution that can be further marginalized by this framework. So it risks leaving out Jewish people, like Jewish Ethiopians, for example. You probably know Israel permits Jews around the world to settle there under its law of return, but it doesn't grant that right to people known as the Falash Mura, who are descendants of Ethiopian Jews who converted to Christianity about a century ago, many under duress, although many identify as Jewish or of Jewish lineage till today. Would this history come up on U.S. campuses in Title VI complaints? Maybe not, but let me return to where I started, to this moment of anti-constitutionalism aided by attacks on scholarly work that can unsettle what one might assume about Judaism or the scope and meaning of anti-Semitism, and by the coordinated undermining of area studies, as like we see at Columbia, ethnic studies, gender studies, work that has been misrepresented and made marginal. But for any law about discrimination to work well, we need to know we need the knowledge produced by people who've dedicated their lives to understanding comparative histories of race, racialization, gender, and power. And we need it if we really want to think about democratic education and access in a robust way, as we have done, and as people in this room, in this virtual room have done for a very long time now, and not have it be reduced to a thin version of anti-Semitism in the service of meritocracy. So thanks very much. And if you want to talk the legal stuff too, I can talk about that a little bit as well.
Thank you, Rama. So now we can kind of open things up for Q&A. So we invite you to throw your ideas into the chat. And maybe as we let that get rolling, I could ask a follow-up question to our panelists. And there are so many specific things that have come up here, but I'm going to ask a broader question first. And I think one of the things that cuts across all of your presentations is thinking about how the current attacks on higher ed and on academic freedom in particular aren't just about what it means for faculty. And you're thinking about other academic workers. Students are at the center of so much of what you're talking about. You've been addressing the fractured faculty we have and the large contingency of contingent faculty that are working and running our universities. And I also think we can talk about center directors, especially if we're thinking about gender studies and the variety of women's centers and LGBTQ centers. So I'll just kind of pose this larger question to, in the particular struggles that you're looking at, what are the kinds of impacts happening beyond just faculty? How are you thinking about academic freedom in ways that pushes against this idea that it's an individual right that only the tenured few have? And I think that maybe is some of the negative perceptions of academic freedom as an elitist concept. And what are some of the ways that maybe in the work that you're doing, you've been able to use academic freedom as a way of building solidarities across those different groups?
I can answer that. Just the elitism idea is interesting to me because it's never, I've been doing work with the National AAUP for 15 years. I started or actually 17 or 18, because I started as a grad student. I don't want to make myself like sound too old, but I am. But the academic freedom is just a principle. It's a principle that it's a principle that the ability for anyone who's teaching or researching to do it without constraint, to do it without undue interference, to be evaluated by people in the fields that they're in who have the expert knowledge to do it, and not by an administration or not by a foreign government or our own government. That's just that's the basic principle. That's part of it. The other part is that we can criticize institutions, and that includes students doing, the work too. And then also that we can speak on issues of global importance, without being afraid of losing our jobs, because we're trying to push knowledge forward, and not pushing knowledge forward is about improving the common good. It's about improving the public. So if you want to read more about that, I think Joan Scott's book that Isaac got his essay from, about academic freedom as an ethical practice, Academic Freedom and Power, is a really good kind of like a intro into some of this kind of stuff. So the principles are just the principles. It's how they get implemented that's like completely messed up, right? And they get messed up in all sorts of ways. And I think we all know some of the ways that they get really messed up, like when we're told that this is an actual scholarship because it's looking at community-based, we've moved through this a lot, but or move past this a lot, I think, in some places. But, I do hear still, and I see, especially in some of the debates within people who study academic freedom, a real degradation of interdisciplinary work around race and gender. And so so if I think I'm like extra pissed off now because I just read something that someone from the Heterodox Society wrote about interdisciplinary work in particular, and about the need for other disciplines to monitor and to push back against interdisciplinary knowledge, because it's gone amok. It's undisciplined disciplines was the phrase that was used. And so like, I think that is a terrible, and that's supposed to be about academic freedom, right? In the name of saving academic freedom, we have to destroy academic freedom of knowledges that he has no expertise on and doesn't understand, right? But that's a problem with Tom Ginsburg. That's not a problem with academic freedom, right? And so I think that's really important to think about as we kind of move through things. Also, there's a difference between academic freedom and free speech. AUP, for example, supports free speech absolutely, and free expression, but that's different than academic freedom, which is tied to the ability to the training and the ability to do the job of teaching and research, whether you're faculty, tenured contingent, whether you're a student who's hired to teach. It's just the people who do the core duties of the institution, of the university work, which is teaching and research, or it should be, actually. They're real estate conglomerates and all sorts of other stuff. So
one thing I'll just add is Texas legislators absolutely hate the concept of academic freedom. So we've been playing around a little bit with the concept of educational liberty as a different way to name the same kind of set of principles and rights. And it's a little bit harder for them to challenge liberty because they're the party of liberty. So I think that kind of strategy in general has been something that you know, I don't know if it's worked for us, but we found it useful with some audiences.
I think this is like really an important question of how how to reinterpret the principle. We had a really interesting conversation kind of at the center about thinking about the 1940 kind of understanding of tenure and all the criticisms about its limits, the prioritization of tenure as the primary protector of academic freedom, and thinking about it kind of as a constitutional document, and like all constitutional documents is open to interpretation and analysis. There's one article, this is a second point, that there's a really great piece by Alana Gershon in Academe blog, kind of makes the argument that the principle that we're fighting for is intellectual freedom in all workplaces, right? That the ability to have a say in your workplace, to be able to express your ideas, to be able to criticize management, to be able to kind of share knowledge and create knowledge collectively, is something that we should be fighting for in all workplaces. And academic freedom is some subset about the particularities of the workplace of higher education, which is a different kind of workplace that has its own expectations, that has its own standards and analysis and criteria as a peer review, but that its part is just one form of this broader kind of goal of intellectual freedom in all workplaces. And so I think that kind of thinking about how to kind of de-exceptionalize the university, right? But also I think that gets tricky because a lot of those principles of academic freedom are kind of closely tied to that claim to expertise, which on the one hand is also true, right? Like there are certain, in the same ways, I mean, it's this interesting paradox, right? Is that on the one hand, there's this kind of central importance of a claim to expertise. Well, many of the disciplines that we're in and the theoretical traditions that we are a part of, right, for the last few decades have been undermining the notion that expertise is held by elites in particular institutions, that everybody has certain kinds of expertise, right? So I think that there's this kind of a really important and interesting tension, but I think that that's something that is really compelling, and framing it in ways that are both democratizing, but also true to the particularities of higher education. I think is important.
So, Karma, there's a question in the chat that I was planning to ask you. So let's go there. And I think one of the things that a lot of us, especially perhaps those of us in blue states who are kind of having the moment of realizing, yes, this is coming for us. So many of the conversations we're all having kind of end with, well, what are we supposed to do? Well, organize. And I think then there's kind of a lack of clarity around what, how, what's the first step? And I was wondering, could you talk a little bit more about some of the more specific tactics, strategies on the ground? Tell us some of the stories of what was going on in 2022 when you were first kind of mobilizing? Teach us.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a lot to teach you, but I'll say a few things. So, one of the big things for us was to build political relationships with students. And so everyone on the faculty is always afraid of this because the right accuses us of indoctrinating students, but we really just have to get over that. And we have to connect with the students who we know and trust and build politically with them. So very early in 2023, I met with students who I had worked with on some projects with student government. And I said, you guys, this is what's coming down. And it was a coffee conversation, and these students just ran with it. And they developed this entire statewide network called the Texas Students for DEI. If folks are interested in this, these students would be happy to meet with your students and talk about what they did. What was beneficial from that network that they built? Well, one, we had a direct line of communication with them, so our messaging was always the same. Two, a lot of the students in that group were law students, and they didn't have the sort of, no shade by this, but some of the conservative sensibilities of some of the other lawyers that we were working with Legal Defense Fund and AFT, for example. They were just there to try stuff out. And so they actually were the ones who proposed amendments that made SB 17 and SB 18 less bad. So students did that. So that was the most important political relationship I would say that we built. The other thing that we did is a lot of people were anxious about AAUP, given AAUP's sort of historical positions on academic boycotts in Palestine, some of its racist history. And so we had to be willing to function as an AAUP executive committee with a liaison in relation to these other faculty who weren't quite sure about AAUP but wanted to get involved. So it was a lot of extra labor, but it actually made sure that a lot of faculty of color voices were heard. The other thing we did was we started out by, I mean, I did this, I'll just take credit for it. I started out by building a statewide ethnic studies network. And so I had a grad student get me all of the email addresses for all of the ethnic studies leaders at public universities in Texas, created an email list with them. And then from there, we built out this sort of parallel entity to AAUP again, because AAUP is not, now it's pretty big in Texas, but it wasn't in 2023. And so we ended up at the end of it, we had a listserv of about 1,000 people throughout the state who were, you know, submitting testimony, who were writing to their elected officials, who were submitting op-eds, who were talking to their colleagues, and who weren't necessarily doing it in an official way. And to me, one of the big lessons of this was that AAUP is really, really useful, but AAUP comes with a lot of baggage. And it also comes with membership dues. And like, we can talk all day long about why people should pay those dues. But when you're in a time of crisis, sometimes you just have to figure out how to organize people in another way. And so that was part of our strategy. I will say where we failed, we did not have a very good alumni strategy. And so I would recommend to anybody right now to start now getting in touch with your alumni, let them know what your fears are, hold forums for your alumni, really get them activated about the importance of what you do and the role that they can play in it. The other place where we really failed is we just could not get any community organizations or business organizations to be involved. Part of that was because there were so many attacks on everything in Texas, and so people were strapped. But I think like in the blue states, you may not have that same situation. And so reaching out to the LGBT organizations, the ACLU, local NAACP chapters, et cetera, and really getting them thinking about the importance of higher ed now, I think is a really important strategy. We also failed on, you know, persuading our administrators, but, you know, so be it.
Thanks. That's super helpful. Oh, I have lots of follow-ups, but in the interest of moving the conversation forward, I'll come to actually the last comment that came in on the chat that I think kind of builds on the question of practical strategies, which is a question about Rutgers University Senate's Mutual Defense Compact, which honestly I'm learning about as we speak. So I think, you know, one question to make it more broad are there specific tactics or strategies, or maybe even larger organizing principles that folks can use on campuses to leverage the whatever shreds of shared governance actually exist on their campuses currently? Yeah, I'll leave it at that. How do we use our shared governance mechanisms wisely?
I always feel like I'm talking too much. Does somebody else want to go? Well, one thing is you gotta know who's in them and what they're doing. So like with the UCs, it's really huge. It's a huge campus. There's a huge system of campuses, and there's both the local level individual campus shared governance, and then there are all these committees that are system wide. And so you start, I think the first thing you do is start small, and figure out who your representatives are. If you're, you know, my department sends people to every Senate meeting as representatives. They come back with notes. We figure out what to write, if we need to write anything to them, and write to the deans. And we also work. We haven't been successful with this, but we also do work on resolutions. And sometimes the thing about the resolution is you don't even need it to pass. You just want more people to read it, so you can get the information out there, even if you're not getting, you know, like a law. So like a law, because a law is only as good as the culture around it, right? Like the law is only as good as what's there to interpret it. And that's kind of what I was talking about, I guess, in the presentation. So, you know, figuring out how it works and knowing who to go to, and how often things meet. You've got to just kind of know the structure, and they can be very different. Colombia, for example, has a kind of federated governance approach. So they have the different the different kind of colleges and units have their own senates, and so that's different than like the way it works at Davis, for example. So it's hard to do a one size fits all, but kind of response to that. But that's another thing that you could get in touch with the AUP national staff, and they can advise if you have a particular problem, because they do that work with the handbooks. They know the structures of university governance systems, and that's so that would be another place that you could go.
Yeah, I think that's I teach at a small liberal arts school that has a very long and ornery history of shared governance that, like, in all places is being eroded and eroded and eroded, but there's a lot of kind of institutional memory for fighting over a language in the faculty manual that can kind of be super tedious at some points, but also really important. But I think that the thing that we noticed is that it's really helpful to have an organized AAUP chapter that can then put pressure on the institutions. And then the 1966 statement on shared governance, on university governance, is really good, I think, conceptually, in terms of thinking about academic freedom is not just this like free floating principle that exists there that institutions either adopt or don't adopt, right? But it's institutionalized within institutions. And so thinking about kind of shared governance mechanisms and that language, I think, is really important, especially as a lot of administrations kind of go to ad hocery, right? Oh, there's a crisis, we're going to respond this way, right? There's a committee that actually exists to figure out if faculty should be sanctioned. But instead of doing that, we're going to fire people in front of Congress because that was what meets our immediate kind of needs, right? And so this kind of ad hocery, and even that language of there has to be a process and a procedure that looks more democratic, I think is just helpful conceptually, right? It's like conceptually, these are how institutions should be governed, even if we're far, far, far from that being in practice. That statement in particular kind of lays out some really powerful and compelling language to make interventions into specific things. Like a rogue dean who is making ad hoc decisions is just a violation of how institutional governance should take place, right? And if you have that, then you can't have academic freedom, and that I think is really helpful. And I think too that a lesson is that even a small AAUP chapter can do just a lot of work, right? Like bringing people together, sharing information. There's a new chapter at Yale, and it's growing quite rapidly, but it is a chapter that they had no kind of centralized governance. And now you have people in the law school are meeting people in the medical school, are meeting people in the humanities, are figuring out like what's going on at their institution and kind of learning about each other and kind of learning about kind of how the institution works as a whole, and are able to organize together. And that itself is just a necessary like first step. And it's really exciting, and it's good work to be a part of.
I will say, just to add on that, I agree with everything Isaac said. I think that one thing that I would add for people in this audience, we do a ton of service work, just a ton. It's more than, it's more than people in other disciplines do. And one thing that you can do by being in that chapter is really make people understand what it is to be in ethnic studies, a gender studies, or an allied kind of formation, and what that entails. And also kind of democratize the workload a little bit, because there's always some nerd that really gets into governance. There always is. And it doesn't have to be you. It could be Isaac. There could be a political science. I'm just joking. Isaac and I are really old friends, but so I should say that right. But yeah, you can, it's a good way to not have to feel like you have to do everything yourself or just within your unit. And I think I got involved out of student labor stuff, like student labor movement, and then just stayed in largely to be a thorn in the side of people who I thought were doing the wrong thing around the boycotts. And then now the boycott statement is now a neutral one. It's not targeted against any particular academic boycott, like namely Palestine. So, you can move things. It might take a while, but you can do it.
I'm wondering, Oh, I'm realizing I should be watching the chat, and the new comment has come in here. But I'm going to ask this question, and then we can kind of circle back there. And the question I was going to ask has to do with the fact that those of us in fields like gender and ethnic studies have always been in a defensive posture of the discipline. Like that's just been the nature of the way we are trained and how we understand our teaching. So I have heard, and I have said this myself, we are particularly well equipped to respond in this moment. And then Rana, you kind of were situating the formation of our fields within much broader transnational struggles for all sorts of forms of justice, including access to education. So I was wondering if you had, and I'll specifically pose this to Karma and Rana, are there particular things that we have learned from our fields, from the histories of our fields, that are really relevant to this moment? And I think you were all gesturing towards this in your comments, but are there more explicit things you would want to bring forward of what are the tools and knowledges that we're sitting on that we really need to tap into right now?
I mean, I'll jump in and say a couple of things. I think the women of color feminist concept of disidentification, working on and against institutions and systems is really useful. So as ethnic and gender studies faculty, we don't have the numbers or the resources or the time to do any of this on our own. And so we need allies who may not be connected with us on all fronts. And to take the Texas example, our AAUP chapter was very new when 2023 happened. I was the only person of color on the executive committee. Like I said before, people had a lot of suspicion. And so, one of my tactics was really to try to push our AAUP to the left, while kind of also doing, I guess, a lot of emotion labor to assure people that this was the right thing to do. This, kind of that this made sense within my understanding of the principles, et cetera, particularly on like the issue of DEI, which Committee A, for example, has often historically, members of that committee have had a very negative view of DEI as actually antithetical to academic freedom. So some folks held that. And so it was like, I wasn't just dismissing them because they might have held that sentiment, but really working sort of on and against. I think that's something that we've learned very well. I think the other big thing, we understand power in ways that most people on university campuses do not. I was getting in a fight with the chair of a traditional department the other day about whether confrontation was the right strategy right now. And she was like, well, I just don't think that that's the right rhetorical strategy with our administration. And I was like, I would love to know the evidence upon which you base your belief about this. Like in earnest, I want to know. And of course, she doesn't respond. But I think calling people in that way to like, I actually understand how power works because I've had to negotiate it through my entire career. You have not. It served you. So maybe those would be for me the two big things that we bring to the table.
I think that's right. I don't think there's much, I mean, I don't and concretely too, I think in this, someone in the chat said something that I just wanted to pull up a little bit. Jenny Lobass, I think that's, if I'm mispronouncing your name, I'm sorry, just wrote like putting things in really clear language that you think is obvious is absolutely not obvious, right? Like Trump could threaten our Pell Grants if we don't stop teaching women and gender studies courses. Really, people really start to understand if we can just speak really, really clearly and say the basic stuff. You don't have to say anything like particularly deep or interesting to you. It's going to just be like people really just don't see us on campus. They think all we do are talk about ourselves. So they miss a lot of the work. They miss the significance of the work. And so when you have to explain it to them, and it's annoying, but it's necessary.
I think it's also helpful to use that language of disciplinary expertise as a way of saying, hey, there isn't this idea that like, women, gender, and sexuality studies or critical race studies just like became woke, right? Just kind of like dropped out of the sky as these woke disciplines that are indoctrinating, just doesn't understand kind of how expertise and disciplinary knowledge is formed, right? Is that there was an elite white male institution that existed in the 20th century, and there was generations of faculty, decades of work, writing better articles, better books, organizing conferences, creating journals, creating professional associations like this one, doing the incredible amount of labor that made it so certain arguments were on the table and then were academically irrefutable, right? Like certain arguments still contested and still debated, and there's lots, but like that there's that the ideas that are being expressed aren't just like claims being made, but it's deeply researched, evidenced arguments about what counts as knowledge, who's an who, like what race is, what gender is, all of those things. There's just decades and generations of scholarship behind it, and to really like frame that kind of as a way of kind of thinking about a response to this kind of glib notion that institutions, that the work that we do is just kind of not that, right?
So there's a really great question here in the chat that I want to kind of come at from a slightly different angle. And the question is, how can we use NWSA to organize? I think that's an excellent question, but I want to preempt that question with a question to you, Isaac. Would you like to tell folks a little bit about some of the practical resources and toolkits that the center has been producing, and some of the kinds of strategies you've been using with how you've collaborated with some other professional associations? And then we might use that to kind of think more broadly about what could be done here at NWSA, specifically around our field and with a larger vision.
Yeah, so no, that's a great question. So in general, the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom has kind of three main goals: is to create very practical resources that can be used in the immediate defense of academic freedom. We have a bunch of that. We have an academic freedom syllabus. We have an academic freedom field guide that's up, that's going to be revised very quickly. That's going to have extended information about digital security, about doxing, about legal protections. That should be coming up in the next week. We have reports on how to address FOIA requests, all these kinds of very practical tools. We're also committed to creating primary research in the defense of academic freedom, trying to understand where these attacks are coming from, who's funding them, what's motivating them, but also well-researched kind of responses, like what kind of legislation could help preemptively address this stuff, kind of become a way of producing ideas with a long horizon, and then also to build these strategic partnerships. So one of the things we've done is we've reached out to a number of professional associations, which I think is really helpful, because the AAUP tends to talk to the AAUP about academic freedom in terms that are comfortable to those or recognizable to those who are deep within the AAUP. And that can be, odd to people who aren't, or alienating. And so kind of reaching out to professional associations is a way of kind of talking to kind of a broader slice of the professoriate and the profession, and to basically kind of reach people kind of in a different setting. And so some of the things that we've done, it's APLA, it's a section at the AAA. They invited me to give a talk. So I talked about manufacturing backlash report. And then afterwards, we had a general conversation. I took the notes from that conversation and sent it out to everybody who was in the room. And they've since formed academic freedom kind of subcommittee within their section, and are really working with the professional with the AAA to figure out kind of what academic protections exist. They meet at a regular basis, monthly basis, and are doing work now, kind of thinking about what resources are within the AAA, grants that are available, internships that are available, and how to use that stuff to advance a defense of academic freedom kind of within their organization. And then we've also been working with MESA, the Middle East Studies Association. And one thing that MESA said that would be really helpful would be help convening a group of all the different groups out there doing work on Palestine. So shout out to Kate, who kind of did this impossible job of reaching out to all of these groups and finding meeting times, where we had a kind of an extended meeting where all of these different groups came and introduced themselves to each other. And so it was as a way for a bunch of people who kind of knew each other. Some were working close to each other, some knew each other by name, but to kind of create a kind of a map of the different groups that were working on the repression of speech over Palestine on college campuses. And then that's turned into a series of working groups, including kind of a group that's looking at kind of legal arguments, another group that's working on developing resources. So that kind of being able to host that kind of convening is something that we've been able to do as well. I think it's really helpful when groups say, here's our particular interest and our particular need, and the center is always willing to kind of help support and that work.
I want to just add to what Isaac said. The AUP itself, is doing this Organize Every Campus campaign, and that's really important in addition to all of the kind of more academic-y research stuff that we're used to doing, because it teaches you how to talk to people and how to map out your campus, right? Like, it teaches you to figure out, like, I worked as a labor organizer, so this is partially why I like this approach so much, because you're actually having the face-to-face conversations with the people that are making the decisions, or know the people that are making the decisions on your campus. So it walks you through it in cohorts too. So if you don't have any experience, you're afraid of talking to people you don't know, there'll be a group, you'll be in a group to do it. And I put the link in the chat somewhere up there, but you should, it's not the AUP of 2000, right? It's not the AUP of even 2010 or anything like that. It's a different organization, and the joining in like the Organize Every Campus initiative in particular, but also the toolkits that Isaac's talking about. There's going to be a Title VI toolkit that's coming out fairly soon, I think, in support of some of the legal work that's been going on with the organization. But joining it is, you'll get all of those tools, but then you'll also, for those of you who want really concrete ways of implementing the knowledge that you get, either your own knowledge or knowledge that you're getting from conversations with other people and talking about these issues, or from the toolkits, the organizing has got to happen. It just absolutely has to happen. And that's something that's another thing I think that a lot of people in gender studies really know how to do. That isn't, even if, like, whether it's labor organizing, whether it's community work, whatever it is, that's something, that's one of the skills, just to go back to that other question, that I think that a lot of us can bring to this moment, and that we should be bringing to this moment. It doesn't have to be over intellectualized, like, it really doesn't right now. It's just, he's trying to kill us all. That's kind of it. Then you can just pick your example. But figuring out who to talk to and how to pick the example and how to frame it to talk to someone is important. But we're at an exciting moment. The New York Times is writing about academic freedom all the time. It's the term's out there, and the AUP's, that's the AUP's brand, for lack of a better word, and it has been for over 100 years. So there's some possibility here that didn't exist, I think, even 2 years ago.
I'm popping in there.
Oh, go ahead, Kristen. Yeah, go.
Oh, how about you go? And I'll just take notes.
I'll say something quick, and then I would love to hear what you have to say. So last fall, or at some point, I spoke to the ACLS executive directors meeting about DEI and what was happening. And one of the things I said, I guess, charged all those directors with, is I said, look, I know that you all work, many of you, for small organizations, and that's a feral cat. And you don't have a lot of resources to do this, but one thing you can do is invite and create space, like a webinar space for your members, or space at the conference for your members to have these conversations themselves. So that's kind of what I think is the staff's task. And that connects this question about NWSA, which is, several years ago, I was part of creating an academic freedom committee of the NWSA. And then the person who was tasked with leading it disappeared, and so did the committee. But that was purely a member-driven effort. So our organizations are only as good as we are as members. And so it is not on us to ask Christian and Courtney if they can do this thing for us. It's us creating an infrastructure and saying, Christian, can we use the NWSA Zoom, or can we have a room at the conference, or whatever it is? That's the only thing we're asking of you. we're going to drive this thing as members because it's our organization and we want to take ownership of it. And I think all of us in the academic organizations we're involved with need to take that ownership ourselves and start building those infrastructures ourselves. And I think AAUP has given us all these amazing resources to be able to do it. We just have to put our sort of disciplinary or interdisciplinary spin on it. And it's ready to roll. And so I think like if that's your question, how do we do it? My answer is just fucking do it. That's what we need to do in general right now is just fucking do it. Like now is the time.
Karma, if I could, with your consent, kiss you on the forehead, I would. Courtney is messaging me. She says Karma gets double forehead kisses. But to take on an element of what you shared, Rana, which is like we don't have to intellectualize this. My introduction to feminism was not in a classroom. It was eavesdropping while my 11 aunts were having their book club on the porch in Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn. Everyone needs to know that. Even though I live in Texas, I'm just like everyone needs to know. But I think that all of us, to some degree, being in the role of the executive director, I interact with members. I cold call you sometimes if I can find your phone number. We email back and forth, and it's a pleasure to be of support. But what I learn more and more is that folks are asking larger questions systemically, but we can't theorize our way out of community. And it may seem repetitive and it may seem very lofty and it may seem dismissive given the many violences we're witnessing or trying to survive literally, but we know how to do this work. The most delicious element of feminist scholarship, whether we're talking about a textbook, a syllabi, or how we exchange resources, it's typically creativity. And I think the question of what do we do next is not looking for a 10-step guide. The syllabi are great, the webinars are great, but really I think we're in a crisis of courage. And courage does not mean shaming of not having the means. People ask us all the time, can we do this for NWSA? And our budget is $7, but I know how to stretch my $7 to make the space. And I say that with immense gratitude for Isaac and Liz and Rana and Carmen, especially Kate, and my right hand, left hand, head, neck, knees, shoulders, toes, Courtney, because all we do is outreach for collaboration. We all are invested in some degree, I hope, of human rights. So how do we make that possible and delicious and speak the language of pain, which most people are now becoming accustomed to quite differently. And I just want to share a couple of points that I've been taking notes on. And Courtney, again, my left hand, right hand, really the brains of the operation. She would probably cuss me out if she were here. I can see her on the screen saying that. But I want to highlight something that I heard Moon Charania say in 2018 in a really dusty basement lecture hall back in Atlanta. She said, in order to destroy the canon, we must know the canon. And to take that into consideration of what Isaac has offered us is knowing governance allows us to utilize it against the university. The university is invested in, founded in, and sustained through settler coloniality. All of us are critical to some degree, but we all are connected to the academy. So how do we take these tools that the AAUP, Center for Defense of Academic Freedom, are kind of packaging for us and make that even more delicious? I love the word delicious. I'm a pleasure practice kind of gal. And to highlight what Jenny said in the chat, which is naming and making visible is often the first step. And so with NWSA, our hope, as you may have heard me note in our conference materials and in my many dissertation length newsletters, we're in chrysalis season. NWSA is community-based. And so what we've done is opened up our website to make it more member-friendly. So we implore you to use those spaces with improved security and privacy so that folks who need this space can do so freely. That looks like celebrating your wins, you may have noticed that, but also organizing to uplift Karma's recommendation. If you have skill sets or other comrades who are not formally in academia who might lend themselves to this work, how can we make that more accessible? How can we invite folks like Karma or Rana and Liz and Isaac and other folks who are doing this work to your classrooms, to book clubs, to spaces where feminism lives, because I don't need the degree. I have one to be a staunch feminist. And I think, again, this conversation asks us to redefine the contours of academic freedom so that we are not hiding behind title or hiding behind our perceived precarity, because we do have folks like our beloved Women and Gender and Equity Center practitioners. Both of our Women's Centers committee chairs, Dana Bissignani and Letitia Price, are fierce advocates based in Ohio and no longer are employed. We were on a national call with other Women and Gender Equity Center practitioners, over 100 attendees, and their question was, what can we do when our parallels in the faculty say, since we're not in the classroom, we can't have those academic protections. We can't uphold these principles. And so sometimes in search of these answers, I hope we ask different, more malleable questions. The last thing I'll say is please fill out the survey. Courtney's going to put it in the chat. We have tons of resources that we're developing. I have a passion project, which is our resource library. You'll find direct links to the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom there, curriculum strategies, and so much more that we're building out. I especially want to emphasize our mental health resources for folks who are just looking for different ways of building community or support because we're living in the end of times. I would like to cuss, but I won't because I respect you all. Although I don't think that's a bad thing. But we're navigating these challenging moments. And what I want to uplift, which is something that helps me hold this container, is to quote Alexis Pauline Gumbs' The Shape of My Impact. She writes that the university was not created to save my life. The university is not about the preservation of a bright brown body. The university will use me alive and use me dead, but the universe knows how to love me. And I want to share that in terms of wrapping us up because the universe is us. The universe is community. All of us have skill sets. And so taking NWSA from this bureaucratic organization into a grassroots community space asks all of us to be seeds that we can water. So if the academy is not going to give us the answers, how do we take the structure that Isaac laid out, that Rana so beautifully, Rana, if you could start narrating audiobooks, I would love it. But if taking out these different categories, karma's examples of organizing, and use them in different utilities, because I like to believe that every person who is drawn to NWSA, to our beautiful interdisciplinary field, will always do feminist work, but the vehicle will always change. Whether that's professorships, practitioners, being a disruptor in other spaces, which I love to be. If you want to do a book club, invite me. All those different spaces where we can make change happen. A lofty, lofty, lofty wrap up, perhaps, but one I think that is so deeply rooted in what we teach, practice, and hope for when we think about imagining new ways of doing this work.
Thank you. We should do a webinar on the practitioner's question.
As a former Women's Centers and Gender Equity Director and founder, sign me up 3 times. I'm very passionate about the ways that we do education in all different components. And shout out to Courtney for doing all them links.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Please fill out that survey. You'll get more resources. We love to be in touch. Have a beautiful rest of your Wednesday. To the panelists, thank you so much for being geniuses and generous with your time and helping us give language and strategies for moving forward. Oh, and it wasn't April Fool's. Our conference call for proposals deadline was extended.
Good to know. Good to know. People did wonder.
Great.
Thanks all.
Thank you.